to the We Are Podcast, a podcast and community empowering Black, Latino, API, and Indigenous people to excel and build wealth in the industries of tech and sustainability. As you know, we aren't just a podcast. We have an online community where you're a safe place to connect with others, people like you. If you haven't done so yet, please join our community at weare.online. Okay, now on to our guest. Peter has been in the tech industry for almost 20 years. He currently empowers the next generation of Asian leaders and sellers to lean into their identity through authentic sales, business practices that leverage Eastern values as a superpower. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Trey. It's an honor to be here. I love what you're doing for the community and excited to reconnect. I'm glad we stayed in touch.
And guys, I've actually known Peter for quite some time now. We've actually been colleagues at a previous company, a previous tech company as well. So Peter, I'm glad to reconnect and look into what you're doing now.
Appreciate it. Yeah, excited. Let's dive into it. Excited for the chat.
Love it. Okay, so I've been following you on LinkedIn since we went our separate ways here, and you're doing some great stuff, especially like coaching sales. I mean, it's not just Asians, right? You're doing so like empowering tech leaders, right?
That's right. Yeah. So founders, CEOs, anybody that's felt like the other, I like to say. Okay. And growing up in tech sales, being in enterprise sales specifically, I didn't see a lot of role models who look like me. A lot of people think about Google, Meta, Amazon, and of course, there's a lot of Asian faces, right, in roles outside of enterprise sales, but within like a pure business executive context, faces like you and me don't show up that often even today.
Yeah.
And so I'm very passionate about giving back to our community, making sure they feel confident showing up in a business leadership, sales executive standpoint, where the world can finally see us as not only polish and having presence, but also having creativity, and really being able to have a high ceiling when it comes to business positions.
Let's kind of take us way back a little bit. Let's take us back to almost 20 years ago when you first got into tech. Like, yes. How did your journey start?
Yeah, it kind of almost started accidentally because I graduated as an econ major at Stanford. And at Stanford, for those other folks who went to my alma mater, if you're an econ major, it felt like at the time for me, there were two paths. You either get into a really prestigious consulting firm or you get into a prestigious investment bank, Okay. And unfortunately, I got rejected from every single firm that I applied to. So I remember being in an interview with BCG. I was trying to get into Goldman Sachs. I was at an interview in New York with JP Morgan Chase, and I didn't get a single offer. And so my senior year in college, I was actually pretty depressed. I was like, here I am, a Stanford grad, wanting to get into a profession that reflected my academic background, but not being able to do it. Now, it was a blessing in disguise because I don't think I would have been a great fit for consulting or investment banking. And one of my best friends had done an internship at Google. And so he introduced me to a recruiter at Google. I barely got into kind of the last batch of interviewing. I missed the Stanford interview days because, of course, I did. I guess like the system was down or, my resume didn't upload. There was something like that. Wow. But I was able to squeak through and I was interviewing with all these other college grads from different universities and they hired me as an online operations associate at Google. So that's how my journey in tech started.
Love it. So kind of walk us through to the other companies that you've been through and like how you climbed the ladder to end up starting your own business.
Sure. Yeah. So at Google, I started selling AdWords. Then I went to an experimental team that was selling television commercial space, actually on an auction system. So that's where I tell people I got the startup bug because even though Google was a big brand back in 2008, 2009, 2010, not a lot of folks knew about why we were getting into television commercials. And this wasn't, we were selling some YouTube streaming ads, but it was mostly traditional TV repurposed on an online auction system. And so with that sales experience, I was like, you know what? I actually like being the underdog. I like explaining why Google is in an experimental field. So then I poked my head out and I was like, what are other companies out there that are a lot smaller than Google where I could be part of the build phase? And Dropbox at the time was about 90 employees. And so I went through the interview process. My friend invited me to dinner actually at their cafe, and over like catered dinner, I was interviewed and ended up joining the company. At Dropbox, when I joined, it was still a consumer company, but they wanted to experiment into the enterprise space. So me, loving the experimental track, I decided to volunteer to see if Dropbox could crack into that enterprise space.
Mhm.
One thing led to another. I ended up closing Dropbox's first Fortune 500 logo on an official contract. It was NBC Universal. And then from there, I ended up talking to a lot of product-led growth founders who were wondering, okay, how did you do this at Dropbox from a consumer self-serve perspective and now graduating into enterprise? And so I had a lot of fun actually just casually meeting founders, ended up joining Slack when they were looking into the enterprise space, was there for a brief while, left, and then started going smaller and smaller. Slack was around 350 employees when I joined, and I always had this dream of going from Google, which was 40,000, then to
Mhm.
Dropbox, which was about 100 employees, then to like a 20-person company, and then to
Mhm.
founding my own company. So
Yeah.
Slack felt like a little bit of a detour from that progression.
Okay.
But then I ended up joining a company called Front. And then I was like, you know what? I love helping the build phase, but there's a lot of risk in joining startups in terms of
Yeah.
figuring out who you can jive with, the product market fit. So I opened up my own consulting practice. This was back in 2017.
Ooh.
And then you and I intersected because one of my clients was Twingate.
Mhm.
And initially I said I was going to do a 3-month assignment, but I ended up joining as a VP of sales for 2.5 years.
Got it.
And then I left that company because I felt like, okay, there was a lot of growth, a lot of learning from going to 0 to 5 million in ARR, 0 to 600 customers. Now I had a lot more wisdom starting from a brand that really wasn't known at the time. And so 2 years ago, I decided to leave that and then focus
Mhm.
full time on my passion, which is mentoring founders, mentoring startup sellers to go from underdog to maybe misunderstood to being the outsider to feeling confident in a pitch when they're selling their product.
Love it. Love it. No, no, I've been following that journey since day one. I love that. I love what you're doing now. I love like the quality of the content has been improving every single month.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And
I
you know what?
mean,
You had a lot to do with that because, our first catch up call after I left Twingate, you told me, hey, you got to figure out your camera
yep.
situation. The one thing I didn't do, so I got a better camera, better mic. I didn't get greenery. I remember you telling me I
Yeah.
need a plant too. So I'm going to have to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, just add a little color back there. Add a little
Yeah.
color. No, but no, that's some great stuff. I'm seeing all the improvement. I like a lot of the guests. I love the conversations. Very, very insightful stuff. So when it comes to creating content and then also marketing your coaching business, like how are you seeing that working? Is it working really well for you?
It is, and that's the reason why I continue to put out content. I'll be honest, the first
Mhm.
quarter or two,
Yeah.
it wasn't an overnight success in terms of me seeing the value of my content. And there were a
Mhm.
lot of posts, a lot of videos I was putting out there that wasn't getting a lot of views. And even today, with the LinkedIn algorithm changing, that's my primary platform. There's a
Mhm.
lot of variability into what content does well and what doesn't. But
Mhm.
the reason why I find it very valuable is because it creates a research rabbit hole for people who eventually talk to me, right?
Yeah.
So I've had
Ah.
founders come to me on first calls and they'll tell me, Peter, I actually listened to 5 of your episodes over the last week when I was at the gym with like your podcast, and I
Mhm.
learned a ton. Or they'll reference a video from a year ago, which I remember had very little likes and comments, but they'll
Uh-huh.
say, and they didn't like it or comment on it, but they'll say,
Yeah.
hey,
Yeah.
I listened to that video along with 5 others, and I understand your philosophies, and you seem like a very approachable person. And a lot of what you're talking about is the advice that I need. And
Mhm.
so I always like love starting a conversation from common knowledge and a common starting point, a common anchor point, and that being the content that you intentionally create is way more powerful than selling somebody, right?
Yes.
Ironically,
Yes.
I actually hate selling people. I like to tell people, like I
Yeah.
like to work with people who are like, hey, I need your help.
Love
And
it.
when
Yes.
somebody's like, hey, I want to hear the pitch, it's almost like, like I almost disqualify the conversation a little bit, right? Because
Oh.
if you're looking for a pitch, there might not be a common set of
Yep.
values or
Uh-oh.
philosophies that we align on. Whereas if you're coming to me from my content, I know because my content is focused on authenticity, being genuine, being Asian American,
Yeah.
I know there's already that instant, like little bit of um, rapport
Yeah.
or like trust that's built, right?
Yeah. So there's already that qualifier there, right? It's like they're a qualified lead for you by them already understanding the way you work and like understanding
Exactly.
values.
And they've already
Love that.
invested time in me, right? Whether
Yes.
that, even though we haven't spoken before.
Yeah, but you got their attention, so that's actually a very that's very expensive. Having someone's attention for an hour with them watching your content, you're on their mind.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So that's I think the value of content and yeah, why I love putting it out there.
Mhm,
Especially when I feel like, oh, I haven't seen this type of content before, or I
mhm,
don't feel like people are talking about this particular topic, then
mhm.
you start to become a lot more differentiated and unique.
Love that. Let's talk more about your actual coaching business. Like, who is it for? Tell me
Yeah.
more about it. Like, kind of like maybe the structure it is, so like others can possibly, like, if they want to start their own coaching business and how they're like actually build, the framework of their business.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So there's a few flavors of it. I'll try and
Okay.
condense it.
Okay.
My main business is what I call this on-demand coaching business for founders who are seed to Series A in venture funding. And so what I do for these founders, typically they have no sales experience. A lot of them are former engineers, former product managers, former like operators of business even, but haven't done enterprise sales. And the way that I structure it is I do these 3-month sprints. I meet weekly with the founders. And I also listen to 10 calls because I believe that the call is indicative of how the rest of your sales process is going to go and how differentiated your messaging is. And
Mhm.
hopefully, over those 10 calls, when I review them over 3 months, there's improvement because we're talking about the calls and where we need to actually button up the sales process in our one on ones. And then the reason why it's called on demand is because a lot of people, consider me a sales therapist or sales doctor. And so I open up
Love
a
it.
Slack channel with my founders and they can message me whenever they want. So
Ah,
obviously it's not scalable that portion because I can't take on 50
yeah.
clients and be like just messaging people every hour of the day. But sales never sleeps, deals never sleep. And
Mhm.
so I pride myself on being available when things get tough, when there's an email message somebody needs to craft, when there's a negotiation call with their first like $500,000 contract that they want to talk through. I'm there as like a sales therapist as well. So that's my primary business. Because I've mentored a lot of sales folks as well, a lot of my mentees are sales leaders at startups too. And so
Mhm.
I end up doing speaking engagements or doing trainings for sales teams as well. But my primary business is really helping founders figure out what their authentic sales voice is. How do they actually practice sales without feeling salesy, right? And how do
Got
they
it.
actually, even as an introvert, because a lot of my founders are introverted, they will admit that.
Yep.
How do you still show up confidently?
Love that. Love that. So I know your coaching programs is open for everyone, but you also have been focusing a little bit on the Asian community as well. So can you tell me more about the Asian community of what you've seen and how you've been empowering other Asians with your
Yes.
coaching program? Yeah.
Yeah, so the reality is, there's this concept called the bamboo ceiling, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? Are you familiar with the
No,
bamboo
no,
ceiling?
tell me more
Okay.
about it.
So the bamboo ceiling is this the fact that as Asian Americans and Asians, in the data, you'll see that we have a limit to how far we've been able to get promoted into the
Yeah.
executive suite.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So there's a lot of articles written about the bamboo ceiling. And so, we represent 13% of the workforce, but in the Fortune 500, something like less than 1.5% of the C suite is Asian or Asian American.
Mhm.
So there's no other explanation to that other than that there's some discrimination and stereotyping that happens.
Mhm.
And a lot of the
Mhm.
stereotypes I've lived, right? So a lot of folks think we're really hardworking. I've gotten that feedback a ton, and like I am one of the highest outputted employees on the teams that I've been on, but
Mhm.
somehow we're not tapped to
Yeah.
lead,
Yeah.
right? Because of XYZ excuse. And as a young professional, I thought maybe it was a problem with me, right? And I'm sure it's a two-way street. I'm sure there's things I could improve on, but the data shows that your race has had an impact on that in corporate America, right? And
Wow.
so
Okay. Yeah.
now, like, how does that impact how I show up in the community, right? I think if we understand this reality, we can start to change it. And so I write a lot about what it felt to be an Asian American male in internal sales meetings or client meetings, what it's like to be passed up for promotions when you're the number one producer. And by talking about that, I'm hoping that people can say, you know what, this really isn't fair. And we need
Mhm.
to make sure that the system changes And the way that it changes is not just us complaining, it's also making sure the folks who aren't giving us the promotions or the systems that aren't giving us the promotions understand our values,
Yeah.
right? And just to give you one example, I talk about Eastern Confucian ideals quite a bit. In Confucianism, you are not the center of attention, right? The group, the whole of the community is placed on a higher level than the individual. So in sales, I think that actually gives people who come from that background a huge advantage, because
Mhm.
as a seller, I'm always thinking about my prospect. I'm always thinking about, okay, let me listen and figure out how I can fit into their world, not the other way around. And I
Mhm.
think the best sellers do that in a very like elite manner, right? If you're able to think about the prospect, be collaborative, be genuinely curious in them, not yourself, you will be a better seller. And that
Mhm.
comes from a lot of Eastern values.
Yeah. So that's exactly the reason why we started We Are. We want to create that community of togetherness and being able to empower each other. Like being able to like motivate each other, right? Because some of us
Yeah.
are introverted. We need that safe place to meet and like help each other out and like learn from other people's experiences. I mean, let's say like for example, like what would you say for someone who actually feels like they don't belong, don't belong because of their ethnicity or background?
Yeah, yeah. I would the first thing I would do is try and talk to folks within the community who have felt the same way and how they've overcome that, potential imposter syndrome or that
Yeah.
insecurity of being the outsider, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of us have lived through it, right? So me now being almost 39, I wish I would have had somebody to talk to about how did you overcome racial bias in your organization, right? Is it the organization or is it me or is it a combination?
Hmm.
Usually it's a combination, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's one thing I would do. The second thing I would do is don't be afraid to be vocal with the folks who aren't in your community too, right?
Oh,
Because
that was a hard
I
one.
think that's a great data point, right? So if
Hmm.
I'm concerned that my direct manager has this bias or I'm getting passed up for opportunities, and obviously in the first conversation, you're not going to say, "Oh, I'm being passed up because I'm Asian,"
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
seek to understand from the other side too. Say like,
Hmm.
"Hey, I have this insecurity being Asian American male. I might be projecting this on you as my manager potentially, but I just want to let you know that in that meeting when Bobby Joe spoke over me, I felt very much like I didn't have a voice. And for me as an Asian, it's hard to speak up because I wasn't brought up to be the loudest person in the room.
Hmm.
And so like
Hmm.
how can we like can you help me with that, as my manager? Like that's a
Ooh,
very hard discussion,
it is.
but most people want to help,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like most people
Exactly.
have biases not because they're aware of them, it's because they're not educated on them. And by the way, if your manager, after having that conversation, somebody says, Peter, your feelings are disregarded, or like that's not what's actually happening in the meeting, right?
Hmm.
If you get that sense, that's maybe a data point that you're not at the company you should be at,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I think that is my advice is seek support, but also don't be afraid to accelerate bringing the elephant in the room up, because life's too short to be in an organization where you don't feel supported, not only from your community but also from your allies.
Yes, love that. Love that. Very, very motivational. Motivational. I love that. I mean, okay, one more on this topic of like, if someone is struggling with a major setback, what was the kind of the first thing you would tell them to kind of shift their mindset? Don't have that growth mindset. It's just stuck because they're feeling bad for themselves. I
Hmm.
mean, what would your advice to kind of like change this mindset and get them going again?
Yeah, my advice would be to figure out what gets you excited about life and
Ah, yeah.
what gives you energy, right?
Mhm.
Because usually when people feel stagnant, they're focusing their day to day tasks on things that are energy draining, not energy giving. And I know it sounds like overly simplistic, but that has done wonders for me in my career, and like it's like
Yeah.
you take note of the data points. If every
Mhm.
day I'm getting up and I'm dreading going to a specific meeting, that meeting probably isn't the type of meeting that was set up for my working style,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If I'm interacting with people I don't get along with, then I need to make a shift in the people that I'm collaborating with day to day,
Mhm.
right? If I hate sales because of XYZ reason, I probably shouldn't be in the profession. um And then also like think of I just was in this session earlier this morning from these two folks influencers on LinkedIn where the title was work like you work out,
Okay.
which I think is really interesting. And they're talking about, hey, if you like doing short spurts of high intensity workouts, like you're a CrossFit person, then you should probably map that to your day to day working style, right? If
Oh.
you're like a deep work person and you're a marathon runner, that makes sense because marathon runners run for a long period of time and it's like
Mhm.
isolated, right? So think about that. If you're feeling stagnant and stuck, like where are your energies going and how does that map to your personal life too?
Mhm.
And set up your schedule in that fashion, right? Like a lot of people tell me, oh, like if you're feeling like you're not being productive, you need to set aside like 3 hours of deep focused work time, right? Like we
Mhm.
probably heard some version of this, but I don't work like that actually. I can imagine doing something for 3 hours straight.
Yeah, yeah,
I'd
exactly.
I'd rather do like 20-minute sprints and then do like 45 minutes, right? And then maybe
Mhm.
like spend 15 minutes taking a break, or then like go work out in my home gym for another like 20 minutes, right? So
Yep.
I don't know if that's like overly simplistic or what you're getting at, but yeah,
Oh,
if you're feeling stuck, think about what drives you personally and what gives you energy, and
yeah.
try and mimic that in your professional life, right?
Love it, love it. That's so much knowledge bomb right there, dropping so much knowledge. I love that, love it. So you know what? There's this one story. There's one time you and I were on the phone, and I needed help. I was leading the growth marketing team, and I needed help negotiating a contract. And
Mm.
and one of the things that brought me was like your negotiating skills are like pristine. I've never I wish you were there when you helped me buy my car so I can get a discount. But you were able to close this vendor for us at like literally less than 50% of what they're trying to offer for us with negotiation skills. I mean, which is what I remember you for so much. Is like, man, you're like the best negotiating person that I know.
I
And so
appreciate that.
I want to actually kind of like bring that back and kind of like let's kind of dissect it. Like I want to there's some things that I know that you did that can where other people can possibly repeat if they work at it. So like I'm curious, like what are some secrets to like maybe any type of negotiation, whether it's not necessarily vendors, but when it comes to negotiating, what are some things that we
Totally.
need to at least know?
Yeah, and you'll have to refresh my memory on the details for that particular one, right?
Mhm.
Or maybe it's both hazy for both of us.
Yeah, yeah,
But I'll talk in kind of like generally how I think about
yeah,
negotiation,
yeah,
and then you can
yeah,
match up how you felt with like what I'm saying, if that
yeah.
works.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, generally, I think for negotiation, the number one thing I tell folks is negotiation is not just about money. A lot of people think negotiation is about the dollars that are on the piece of paper, right? But the reason why people can sometimes get 50, 60, 70, 80% discount is because there's a lot of value outside of the monetary amount. So what are some of those
Mm.
things, right? If I'm a salesperson or a vendor, let's say, one of the things, and we might have done this in this particular situation, is timing, right?
Yeah,
If I
yeah.
can have a conclusion to the deal this week and something signed this week versus 3 months out, that's value to me as a sales rep, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I can now move on to the implementation or move on to another deal and know that, okay, Dre is going to now be a formal client of mine, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm,
that's just one example. Another example is, obviously, if you're a startup and you're trying to close a big deal, you might give 50% off if that big deal is willing to talk about you, right? If you're able to say, hey, NBC Universal is a customer of ours, that has inherent value, right?
mhm.
And a lot of people say like you can't put a dollar amount to that because if
Yes.
NBC uses your product, then who else is going to use your product, right?
Mhm,
And then so those are like a couple examples of like it's not just the monetary amount. The
mhm.
second thing is negotiation is very human to human exercise. A lot of people
Got
try and get away with structuring the perfect email or trying to assume or predict the next step, right? And
Mhm,
sure, there's a certain amount of that if you're a strategic negotiator and you've been negotiating for years and you're a grizzled vet in the space. But at the end of
mhm,
the day, it's a person to person thing. So a
mhm,
lot of founders that I coach oftentimes don't want to get on calls. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to send this other proposal." I'm like, "Hold the horses here, right?
mhm,
Get on a call with this person, talk to him or her like a human, and get them to open up about the things that I was talking about. Like, what do they care about, right? Like,
mhm,
what are their constraints and what is your goal in this? So I think that's also another thing. It's a human to human thing, which is why
Mhm.
I focus a lot on phraseology, because you could
Got it.
say one thing, you could mean one thing, but say it in
Mhm.
two ways.
Got it.
So
Phraseology. Tell me more about
exactly. So if I'm
phraseology.
like,
What?
Dre, listen, I can't, this is like my limit. I can't do
Mhm.
this.
Okay.
Like it's $50,000 or we don't do the deal, right? That's very different from, hey, Dre, like it's really hard for me to go below $50,000 to get that approved
Mhm.
because I have a lot of internal obstacles that I'm overcoming, right?
Okay.
You be the first person to get that discount amount. I only have a limited number of discounts I can give. I'm at my limit. And by the way, um, like if we go down to this level, the service I provide you is going to be a lot lower too. So
Mhm.
those are two of the same things, actually. The first one,
Uh,
though, sounds very closed off and combative and almost like, abrasive.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
second way that you phrase that is extremely collaborative and focuses on a lot on providing context and conveying empathy, right?
Yep.
So I think
Yep.
that's the other thing too, like negotiation, like high level negotiation
Mhm.
relies a lot on your ability to collaborate, be empathetic, and to try and seek the win-win scenarios, right?
Got it. Love it. Love it. Those I actually remember those everything that you touched upon there within that negotiation with that certain vendor. You hit like you like remind me exactly what happened. Like we said, hey, we'll do a customer testimonial for you, and you knew that they had a deadline themselves, that they were trying to meet a quota, and you use that
Mm,
against them. You're like, okay, you want us to sign this now? We
yeah.
will. Just
Yeah.
give us a
If you're going to
discount.
try and make us do something unnatural, then you got to also give in too. It's a two-way street,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like both there's power dynamics in negotiation and you can't always be the one saying yes, yes, yes.
Yes, love that, love that. And okay, so you mentioned some don'ts, like being a little bit abrasive. What are any a couple more don'ts, or like what are some other big maybe mistakes that you see when it comes to negotiations?
Yeah, yeah. I think another big mistake I see, especially in enterprise sales, is assuming the
Okay.
person you're talking to is the one who holds the power, right? So in
Oh,
enterprise, there's a stat now where it's like takes like 7, 8, 9 decision makers in an enterprise organization to come to a decision, right?
yeah,
But
yeah, it does. Yeah.
oftentimes, like junior negotiators will be talking to someone, maybe it's their champion, somebody who's really excited, and they will think, oh, okay, this person has all the answers. The answer to
Mhm.
that is no, because if you're in like a 50,000 person org, there's a lot of people who come out of the woodwork to say, "Oh, I'm actually like not sure we should buy this product," or "What about this? What about their security risks? Oh, they're a startup. We don't like to work with startups because they're risky."
Mhm.
So one thing that negotiate in enterprise B2B sales and negotiation, you need to vet the detractors who aren't on the call, right? Like you need to figure
Yeah.
out, okay, if Dre's really excited about purchasing my product, who's not excited? And how do you diffuse those people? So that's
Mhm.
another thing I think a big mistake in enterprise negotiation that people make.
Mhm.
So I'll say that, and then
Yeah.
let me think about like live if there's anything else that I'm missing that I coach quite often on.
Yeah.
I think I already mentioned this, but never negotiate over text or email,
Oh no, you didn't say that. So
right?
okay,
So
why not?
because there's so much in tonality, there's so much
Oh,
in terms of like real life, how you can go back and forth and be dynamic that can't be
yeah, yeah,
replicated over email, right? And
got it.
negotiation is one of those points when a lot of people can get offended
Yeah.
depending on what you offer, right? And so I tell founders never negotiate over email. It also short circuits it because on a live call you could talk about like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different numbers if you wanted to. In an
Mhm.
email, it's just not possible, right? And you'll waste a lot of time.
Mhm.
Sometimes I've seen founders say, like, hey, Peter, can you look at this pricing proposal? And I'll ask, like, where are these discounts coming from? And they'll start to guess. They'll say, well, I think they can afford this because of this. That's the most dangerous thing in sales, is making assumptions.
Got
And
it.
so that's the other thing is never try and negotiate over text unless you're negotiating the boundaries of unless you're negotiating the process, right, of a number that's already like pretty crystal clear. But
Mhm.
most of the time when people are trying to negotiate over email, they're not getting to the root of what's going to get the deal done. And you can only get that over a call or a live meeting.
Got it. Got it. Speaking of like learning more, like I'm pretty sure there's a lot more things we can learn on negotiation. I mean, what are who are some of your maybe mentors or like maybe books we can read on the topic of negotiation? Do you actually,
Mm.
help coach on negotiation in your sales coaching program?
I do. Yeah, yeah. It's still like probably one of the top things I coach on, right?
Ah,
Because it
okay,
feels
okay,
so like what do you call it? Like it's hard to demystify negotiation with
okay,
what's out there in the media, right? So you hear
okay.
like Glenn Ross. Have you seen that clip
No,
where
no.
Alec Baldwin is saying like second place is a set of steak knives, and he says like A, B, C always be
Oh yeah.
closing.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
yeah,
agree.
yeah,
Yeah, okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
That's a famous line right there.
And
ABC.
yeah, and he's very abrasive, and he's like making these sellers feel like they're not worth,
Yeah, yeah.
they're not worth their job, all of that. And so like that's a wrong way to think about negotiation, right? Because it's like
Okay.
hard line tactics.
Mhm.
But in terms of, to go back to what you said, I have a founder-led sales community where we talk about this. I host like Ask Me Anything sessions where sometimes people ask about negotiation. So it's called
Love it.
Zero to Hero. And then there's a couple methodologies or like schools of thought that have impacted me. One is like Sandler training. So Sandler training was invented like decades ago, but the training there has helped me because there's concepts like strip lining,
Mhm.
meaning that I don't know if we'll have time to go into strip lining, but there's concepts like strip lining that tell you in sales you actually sometimes have to act counterintuitively.
Mhm.
Like in sales, if you're always selling, you actually don't get the deal done. When
Mhm.
you're trying to disqualify and push leads away, all of a sudden you find out who's serious about your product. So Sandler methodology has taught me a lot about that concept. And then there's also something called the challenger sale, where similarly, it teaches salespeople to challenge the status quo instead
Mhm.
of just being like a servant focused vendor. And a
Got
servant
it.
focused vendor will agree with everything the prospect is saying, but there's an
Okay.
art in how you challenge prospects too. So challenger sales goes into that. In some cases, you might not want to agree with your prospect,
Mhm. Got
right?
it. Got it.
Because selling is a lot about philosophical alignment. It's as much about that as it is about the product you're selling.
Got it. So I'm curious. So that has to bring me to my last question here on negotiations. But so it seems like there's some type of relationship building going on there, right? Or you're trying to build up some relationships. I mean, how can companies like, or even like people build these relationships with maybe let's say in our case vendors to like make this negotiation work?
Yeah, yeah. So you're talking about more from like if you're the company buying the software.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so if I, for example, because in that case you're talking to sales reps, right? And I used to
Okay.
be a
Yeah.
sales
Yeah.
rep.
Oh
So
yeah. Okay.
the prospects that I really appreciated would ask
Mhm.
me about what my goals were. It's like, hey, Peter,
Oh.
what are
Okay.
your
Yes.
goals for this?
Okay.
Right? Like, what would make you look good internally?
Ah.
Right? Like, what are
Okay.
your
Okay.
constraints? What can and can't you do?
Hmm.
Because then it opens up a conversation and it makes me realize actually my prospect cares about me as a person.
Hmm.
Like my customers, NBC Universal, I bring up a ton
Hmm.
because the champion and sponsor at NBC Universal is still a friend of mine.
Hmm.
And why did I get him a great deal? Why did that deal work out? It's because he actually had a vested interest in me as a person.
Hmm.
Right. And so that impacted the deal dynamics, but it also impacted a lot of other fun things. Like we went to Korean barbecue all the time to eat and drink and talk about the deal. Right. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think like that's what I would think about. If you're trying to get a good deal and you are the purchaser, the buyer,
Hmm.
um, don't be afraid to ask your sales rep, like, what is going to help you? Right. Is it the
Got it.
price?
Yeah.
Is it a case study? Are you trying to hit a quota? Like, have you never closed a Fortune 500 deal and we're your first buyer, right? Because
Ah.
salespeople
Yeah.
will open up. And obviously, you don't want to exploit those gaps,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
don't want to
Yeah.
say,
It's
oh,
good to
because you've
know.
never closed a
Yeah.
Fortune 500 deal, like I'm
No.
going to
No. No.
grind
But
you
yeah.
down.
No. No.
But
Yeah.
it helps you understand how are you going to get what you want and how are you going to get your vendor to work hard for you to
Mhm.
get you the best deal possible, whether that's based off of money or deal structure or anything else.
Love that. So when it comes to like networking, right? I know. Are you doing any networking with you're targeting the Asian communities? Like, how are you? What are you doing networking wise within the Asian community?
Yeah.
For your business or just in general.
Yeah, so I host a lot of like mixers actually. So I go up to the
Ah.
Bay quite a bit, and so I'll host
Oh.
these events. Sometimes I'll get a
Uh,
sponsor, sometimes
yeah.
I won't, right? And yeah, say again.
No, no, no. I was gonna say like we would love to sponsor like we are would
Oh,
love to
we should
sponsor one of
do
the events.
something.
Yeah,
Oh, that'd be
yeah. We
amazing
definitely collab.
actually. That would be
Love to do that.
let's plan on that. So
Yeah.
just getting like like-minded people in a room together,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And one of the dinners I did, this was now like a year and a half ago, was specifically focused on Asian founders and people
Yes.
who support Asian founders. And
Love it.
so the conversation was a lot about, hey, like, you don't see a lot of people in sales that look like us. Let's start to change the rhetoric, connect with each other, support each other. Right.
Mhm.
I'll say too, like even my non-Asian events, by the way, I hosted another dinner several months ago
Mhm.
with a partner of mine, Common Room. They have like a go-to-market intelligence platform.
Mhm.
And the goal was to get as many like sales leaders into the room. And I purposely made sure I was inviting a good group of Asian leaders into that room, along
Yeah.
with other leaders.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with like white leaders too in there. The beginning speech I gave was that, hey, like I care a lot about modern go-to-market tools, but I also care a lot about diversity. So that's
Mhm.
another thing I'll do. Like even when I'm in events that are not Asian centric, talking about it, kind of what I mentioned at the beginning of this show, right? Like
Yes.
you need allies to understand your effort too.
Exactly. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so yeah, those are like kind of the different things that I'll do. Like
Mhm.
some are very topical around sales, like sales mentorship. Others are purely focused on the Asian community, but whatever it is, there's a reason why I put Korean American sales coach on my LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
Is because I like lead with identity and I try and keep that consistent no matter kind of the context I'm in.
Love it, man. Man, love that. Love that,
Appreciate it, Dre.
man. All right,
Thanks, man.
for this episode to feel complete for you, brother. I mean, any last words? Any last comments for the audience out there?
Like I think the last thing I'll say is just be confident being the other and using that as your superpower, right? Like
Mhm.
I think we've spent generations feeling like we're different and that is a weakness. But I think
Ah,
like the next like few decades are going to be amazing for the Black, Latino, Asian American, Asian, Indigenous peoples communities
mhm.
because it's like our time to shine, right?
Yeah.
It's like not cool to be anything other than diverse now. Think
Yep.
about it, right?
Yeah. Love
And
it. Love
and
it.
mass media has caught on to it. There's a
Yeah.
lot more of us we see in Hollywood, but I
Yeah.
want that to actually be impacted at the corporate level and at the entrepreneur level,
Yeah.
at the Fortune 500 level. And I think those situations are still few and far between.
Mhm.
So just be confident, know that there's people like you and me out there who are ready to help too. And, let's let this be the age of diversity, right?
All right, brother. Thank you again so much for coming on, and we will see each other again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Trey. This is awesome. Appreciate you.